Welcome to Drawing the Beauty of Nature. This is Mindy Lighthipe, and I welcome you to the wonderful world of watercolor. Watercolor is a wonderful medium to work in for all nature subjects. In preparation for the upcoming watercolor class, I wanted to go over some of the supplies that I use so that you can sort of get a feel for what you may want to purchase. One of the things that I would really like to suggest is that you don't go out and spend tons of money in the very beginning. There is a preliminary watercolor list of some essential colors that I would like for you to use, and that really only comes to about 6 or 7 colors, and they do come in a very small kit so that you can economize and not be spending too much money. If you already have watercolors, I suggest that you go ahead and use them and see how you progress, and then you can always add and subtract. My watercolors started out with a small kit, and I probably have 200 or 300 different tubes of paint from different manufacturers, and I'm constantly buying new and more. And I don't want you to go out and spend hundreds of dollars until you've really made a commitment that watercolor is the medium for you. We will start with paper, and one of the things that I want you to think about is that the investment in the paper is one of the things that I would spend my money on. There is a short video that I have attached in a link that I suggest that you watch that's from Fabriano. Fabriano is the paper that I feel is the best quality paper out there for the money, and it comes in a variety of different sizes, in a whole bunch of different things. And I also have a link to cheapjoes.com where you can purchase a variety pack, which would give you a nice sampling of the different types of papers that there are. Here I have the Fabriano, and the Artistico is the kind of Fabriano paper that I use. Here we have a block, and it's a small size, and it could be something that you could purchase to do your exercises in any of the paintings. It's portable, and it's $140. This particular paper is hot pressed, and I will very briefly go over the different types of paper that are out there. There's a hot press, there is a cold press, a rough press, and Fabriano makes what's called a soft press. When you think of hot press, you think of the area being very smooth, and I like to think about an iron pressing down and giving you a nice smooth surface on your paper, pressing down any of the texture. So this is a very, very smooth paper, and it's quite nice. And then you also have cold paper, which I have a little sheet of it here, and it's hard to see in the video, but the cold has a certain amount of texture to it. Fabriano also comes in 2 different colors, and as you can see, this is the natural and this is the extra white. My preference is extra white, but again, it doesn't matter to me what you like. I tend to like my work to be bold and my colors to be very bright. And this has a little bit of a yellowish cast to it. It's certainly something that you can experiment with, but just know that there are 2 colors that are available. The cold press is bumpy, and then the rough, which I really don't recommend for my class, has a lot of texture on it, and it's really not something that I ever use, and so I don't really go for that. Then you have something that's called soft press. And soft press is only made by Fabriano. It is sort of in between a cold and a hot press. It has a slight texture to it, and when I was first starting in watercolor, I found it to be the easiest paper to work on. If you were only going to purchase one paper and you were not going to experiment, my suggestion would be to buy the soft pressed Fabriano Artistico, because it allows you to get detail without it being too textured, and it's very easy and nice to work with. The other thing that you'll find is that this particular piece of soft press is more like a board. It is 300 pound, and it is very substantial. It does come in some smaller sheets and some smaller packs, but for the most part you will always find that in a block like this, the paper is sandwiched down by glue and it comes up. It's 140. The 140 is thinner, and depending on what you like, I suggest the possibility of going into the Cheap Joe's and buying the variety pack, and this way you could experiment with the different papers to find out before you make an investment. I currently buy 10 sheets at a time when something is on sale. I use either the soft press or the hot press from Fabriano, and I will end up purchasing, I think that when they send a large sheet, which is 22 by 30 inches, they require that you buy 10 sheets. So I usually wait for it to go on sale, and then I purchase it in bulk. And this way I have it when I want it. If you're just beginning, experimenting is not a bad idea because you don't want to invest in something that you absolutely hate. When I first started watercolor, my instructors had me use Arches, which is also a French watercolor paper, and I can't tell you how many watercolor artists I know swear by Arches. I personally do not like the paper at all. I find it has what's called a sizing on the surface of the paper, and when I wet it, it has a strange odor, and I find that I have to wet and I have to re-wet, and it buckles, and there's all kinds of things that I don't like about it. When I first started, I ended up having, maybe $50 worth of paper that I've ended up using as collage art or something, but I don't do any serious painting on it because I find it so difficult to work on. But experimentation is a good thing when you're first starting out. I don't recommend any of the papers that you would go and buy at, let's say, Michael's or Joann's or any of the what I consider Hobby Lobby craft type stores. Normally, those are 90 pound, which is a lighter weight, even lighter than the 140, and it will buckle, and it's really not a good quality paper, and you will fight and fight and fight with that paper, and you will really struggle. So if I had to invest in one thing, the one thing that I would invest in is a good watercolor paper, and as I said, there is the Cheap Joe's variety pack, which you could experiment with and decide what you liked better, or you could just go ahead and purchase a small block of paper that would last you throughout this course and see what happens. The links are in the printout, and you can sort of make a decision. For this particular class, I'm going to recommend Daniel Smith. Daniel Smith is my all-time favorite watercolor. I believe that they have a wonderful range of colors, and the tubes normally come in a fairly hefty size. This is a 15 milliliter tube, and I find that it really goes an extremely long way, but the larger the tube, the more expensive the paints will be. There's also Winsor Newton, and in the printable, I have given you some of the same pigment types that are in this essential kit that I'm going to talk about. So if you already have Winsor Newton, or you're not in the country where Daniel Smith paints are available, I find that the Winsor Newtons are available pretty much around the world, and you can easily substitute the Winsor Newton watercolors for the Daniel Smith. There are other paints such as Cotman or Grumbacher, and they normally are considered student grade paints, and I do not really recommend that you use a student grade paint. It's not a horrible thing to use them, but what happens is there's an enormous amount of filler. I want to talk for just a second before I get into a little bit more, just a little bit of history about pigments. A while back, I was doing a lot of egg tempera, and I purchased these pigments. These are raw pigments, and I have them in these little jars here, and I wanted to just sort of open these up and show you that it's actually, this is the dust that the pigment is made from. What happens is that all color, regardless of whether you're working in oils, acrylics, colored pencil, pastel, it all starts with some sort of pigment. And the pigment can be mined naturally, it can be a synthetic, but what happens is that it's ground into a powder, and traditionally it was done with a mortar and pestle, where the pigment or the mineral or whatever it was put into the bowl and then ground into a soft surface. After that, what happens is that the pigments are then placed with something else. So if I were to take, let's say, a wet brush, and I were to take some of this powder and paint it onto paper, what would end up happening is that I might have a paste or a liquid, and as soon as it dried, it would go back to this dusty powder. What pigment requires is something that is called a binder. A binder is something that is going to actually adhere to the paper or the substrate. When I say the word substrate, I mean whatever it is that you're painting on. So for instance, the oldest form of painting was done in caves. And a lot of the people back then were using oxides and earth-type pigments that they got from clays. And the cave paintings were done on the walls, and they were not exposed to light. So what ended up happening was that they were kept for maybe millions of years because they were not subjected to the weather. They were very well protected in that environment. As things progressed, and man developed different styles of painting, it was discovered that egg yolk had an oil-based medium, and when it was added to some of these pigments, this is actually raw ultramarine, and this is a viridian or a phthalo green, and I've got some cobalt purple, which is one of my favorite colors. And what was very interesting during that time was that with the addition of the egg, what it did was the oil-based bound the pigment to the substrate, and that would have been plaster. So when you see a fresco, you see that it has lasted thousands of years. It's because the pigment has been mixed with something that is going to bind it to the substrate. In watercolor, the binder is called gum arabic, and the gum arabic, I believe it's a plant-based material that is going to bind the pigment to the paper and help to flow. When we're talking about good artist quality paints, you will find that you want to get as much bang for your buck as you can, and you'll find that the pigments themselves will have, let's say if this is the raw pigment, and let's say that there's a tube of paint, that the student grade would end up having like maybe this much pigment, this much binder, and then the rest is filler. So you're not actually getting a big tube of paint. So let's say if you were to purchase a paint, something this size, the actual amount of pure pigment that's in it might be just a small amount, and so your colors would be less vibrant, they would not be as brilliant, and it may seem like you need more paint to go the gamut. If you only have a limited amount of money in your budget, then it's not a completely horrible thing for you to use lesser quality watercolors, but I just wanted you to know the difference. So some of the good quality pigments that are watercolors that are out there, it's Daniel Smith, there's Winsor Newton, there's Da Vinci, there's Maribel, there are many manufacturers out there, and the thing that you want to look for is the price. Now the other thing that I want you to be aware of is that within each paint that you go to purchase, you will find that there is a series. And so in looking at, let's say here I have a phthalo blue, and I'm going to look at the series. Right here it says Series 1, and I believe that Daniel Smith has 4 different series. And the series is how they classify, how they price out their paints. And what that means is that Series 1 would be $10, Series 2 is $15, Series 3 is $20, and it seems like, it gets higher. And, you think to yourself, well, why is the same physical size tube of paint, why is this one $15 and something that is the exact same amount of paint, why is that one $20? I don't understand what the difference is. And what I can explain to you is that it goes back to the base of the pigment. The pigment itself is going to be the key. So for instance, when we look at this cobalt, it looks like this color is extremely vibrant. It looks like it would be really, a wonderful, wonderful thing. But what I have discovered, especially when I was doing egg tempera, is that the actual particle size of this is incredibly fine. The best way to explain it is that this is more like confectionery sugar, which is the real light, fine sugar that you put on the top of pastries. Like for instance, the ultramarine blue, the actual particle size of the ultramarine blue is not as fine. It would be more like regular sugar. And so it takes maybe 4 times the amount of pigment to actually get this color once the binder is put into it. They will have to use a lot more pigment to achieve the color. So when you think about it, if you're using that much more, your cost is going to get higher. And you'll also find that some pigments are more of a mine, they have to be mined, or the manufacturing is more expensive. So that's why when you see a paint, you will see that it has different series, and that's why the price is different for each paint. Usually each manufacturer, like Daniel Smith or Winsor Newton, I believe that they only have up to 4 different series, which is 4 different price groupings, and that's going to let you know whether the pigment is more expensive to manufacture. The other thing that I want you to take into consideration is the light fastness of it. And when you look on the tube, Daniel Smith has a light fastness rating, and I believe that it goes from 1 to 4 also. Number 1 means excellent. When you think of light fastness, that is part of what is in the position of being archival. Archival and light fastness sort of go hand in hand. When you have a painting, and if any of you have looked at watercolors from, let's say, the 16th century, there's an artist, a botanical artist, whose name is Pierre Redoute. His leaves appear to be blue. His work is extremely delicate. The paintings are contemporary in the amount of drawing that he's been able to do. It's beautiful. And then you see these crazy blue leaves and you think to yourself, what was he thinking? Why are these leaves blue? The reason why they're blue is because the yellow that was the component of the green was not light fast. And over years and exposure to light and elements, the pigment has evaporated and faded. I look in all of the pigments that I own. I do not use a light fastness rating unless it is a 1 or a 2. So it sort of goes from excellent, very good, good, and then you'll see the word fugitive. Fugitive is not something that you want to ever purchase. The question you may be presenting to yourself at this point is, well, why would somebody even manufacture something that was fugitive? There are instances, particularly in the design and fabric industry, in the textile industry, where they're not looking to paint something that would be archival. They're looking to paint something for reproduction in terms of it becoming a fabric reproduction. And so the printing process is different. And there are colors out there that are notoriously fugitive. One of them is a color that's called opera. And opera is this amazing geranium, brilliant hot pink. And a lot of people love it because when they squirt it out of the tube, it is amazing. But at the same time, it degrades and disintegrates and disappears very quickly. If you were going to use that as a textile artist, you might be creating, let's say, bed sheets, and you wanted to have this brilliant hot pink balloons for a child's room. It's much easier to squirt that out of the tube, and that's why a lot of these colors are still available. But as an uneducated artist and someone who's just beginning, you may not be aware of light fastness ratings, and it is important for you to learn that. Another aspect of learning about watercolors is that you want to learn about the pigment. A lot of people are very interested in the kinds of pigments, and let's say, one of the things that I found with Daniel Smith is that I believe he has over 250 different colors. And when I started analyzing the side of the tube, I realized that he may have had a phthalo blue mixed with a quinacridone magenta, and he's calling it, purple whatever. And of course, I'm a sucker, I'll buy it. And then when I look on the tube, I realize that I have two tubes that he just produced these two colors together, and that I could easily not have purchased that third tube, but only needed the two tubes. And so it'll also give you more about your light fastness rating. If you want to learn more about the chemistry of paints, you can go to a website which is called handprints.com. And again, I'll put this in the printable, and it will tell you more than I ever really wanted to know about the different chemistries and light fastness ratings of it. But I think as just a broad overview, it's just a good thing to know that these things do come up. There's the ASTM, which is the American Standard Testing and Material, and that has become standardized so that you can, as a consumer, know what it is that you're purchasing. A lot of the paints are no longer carcinogenic, although I can tell you that cadmium, whether it's in oils, acrylics, or any of the other watercolor, colored pencil, that cadmium is supposed to be more of a cancer-causing agent, but there are a lot of other things that you can use besides cadmium, and so I kind of stay clear from that. So let's go back to the Daniel Smith little set that I have here. Again, this is a way for the beginner to start out, and these are nice little tubes, and it's coming with two yellows, two reds, and two blues. And so this little set is available through a lot of the different manufacturers. I believe you used to only be able to get the paints through the danielsmith.com site, but you can get them, I believe, through Dick Blick, Cheap Joe's, Utrecht, a whole bunch of different places here in the United States. And this is the set that I think is going to be something that's going to be very beneficial and will certainly take you through the entire course. I will give you a substitute of these 6 colors in the Winsor Newton. You can see it's the same size tube. I believe that the Winsor Newtons are more expensive, but if you're in a place where you can't find the Daniel Smith, then these are also available. So that's it on paint, and I think that you can, if you have paints already, a lot of the exercises that we're going to be doing are experimental, and it's part of the education of understanding and dissecting color and understanding the properties of it and how and why it works. And so some of the exercises that you can do, you can work with the paints that you have and sort of dissect what is the recipe within the colors that you have and have them work for you. So again, it's not that you have to run out and buy these supplies, but if you are just starting out, it is my suggestion that a small kit like this would be something that would be very beneficial. And I have a few other colors on the list that I think also would be a nice addition to the list. They're more in the neutrals, and so we'll kind of talk about that as we go along. The other thing that also Daniel Smith has, if this is something that might be appealing to you, they have a watercolor stick. And so rather than buying the tubes, I don't think that the tubes are any more expensive than the sticks. But these could actually, you could draw with them if you wanted and then add water, or you could shave off little bits and pieces with a knife into your palette. And so just know that Daniel Smith does have these watercolor sticks, and they basically work the same way. There's also people work with pan watercolors where they come in little cubes that you can have inside your palette, and that's fine too. I tend to like the watercolor out of the tube tube, I normally squirt a huge amount of paint and then work from that, as you'll see later on in future lessons. But I just wanted you to know that these are also available. The next thing that I wanted to talk about are brushes, and it's very interesting to me that there are so many different manufacturers out there, and the brushes range from being very cheap to very expensive. And I have to tell you that I've used the very expensive ones, and I found that I really am much happier using the cheaper brush. And that's kind of interesting because I found when I used the cheaper paper, it was really awful. And then when I used the really expensive brushes, that was really awful. So this particular brush is what's called a round, and the anatomy of the brush is that you have the bristles, and this plated area here is called the ferrule of the brush, and then of course you have the handle. And the shape of this brush is considered a round brush, and the brand that I like the most is Low Cornell. And I've given you a supply. I normally buy my brushes from Huffcraft, which is more of a traditional like faux and folk art painting website, but I usually buy these brushes by the dozen, and at least the smaller ones, because they do tend to wear down. This particular brush I probably had for 10 or 15 years, and it is still going strong. You'll see me use it throughout the course. It is really quite a nice brush, and I don't know, it might be, $10 to $15. A brush this size in a sable Kolinsky, which is an animal fiber, would probably cost about $75. So I don't find any reason to have the really expensive ones. And then there are these smaller brushes, which also are from Low Cornell, and I use these quite often. They're called spotter brushes, and there's the 0 and the 000 are the ones that I prefer the most. And then you have some that are a little bit of a mid-size. So I would have to say that the brushes that I use the most are the watercolor round brushes. And again, you can experiment with different ones, but as I said, I prefer the cheap ones. And then there's this brush here, which is called the chisel brush. And this again is made by Low Cornell. And we're going to use this to lift and remove things, and we'll talk about more on how to use this brush, but this is one of my favorite go-to brushes. There's another brush here which is called a Rake brush, and again this is a Low Cornell, and at the end it's a square brush. It looks very much like the chisel brush, only the chisel brush is shorter, and at the end there's more of a fringe here, and this can be used to implement texture. This is pretty much the brushes that I use. I might have something that's a little bit, this is a number 10, and I probably have a number 4 and then a 0, and that's pretty much the range of brushes that I use, and you will see me use throughout the class. If you're looking for a brush that is a better quality and you are thinking that you might want to spend a little bit of money, you can go to a company which is called Rosemary and Company. She produces her own beautiful brushes from England, and I have purchased them, and I do like them very much. She has some nice watercolor round brushes that I feel are very affordable, and they are a sable brush. And I think that one of the reasons that I like the synthetic brush, and I do like the Rosemary brush, is the fact that it has a stiffness to it. When I paint, I like to have a brush that has some bounce to it and some strength to it, whereas some of the sable brushes are mushy. When you put it down, there's no resiliency. They just kind of disappear and kind of get mushy. And I like the fact that the synthetic fiber doesn't buckle under the weight of the pressure of my hand. It acts more like a drawing tool rather than flopping around. And again, I know lots of artists that do absolutely exquisite work with Kolinsky sable brushes on Arches watercolor paper. So I can't tell you that, oh, it's horrible, you should never use those, because there are people out there that have mastered them and do a beautiful job. I'm just telling you what works for me. Hopefully you'll find what works for you. The next thing are palettes, and I tend to have a lot of different palettes. These palettes I would say, are my biggest preference. They are porcelain, and they're relatively inexpensive. Of course, if you drop them, they're going to break, but I like the fact that they have wells in them. This particular palette here has a whole bunch of small wells and then a small mixing area. And you can kind of stack them. And one of the things that I do is I reconstitute my paint. So what I mean by reconstitute is right now, as you can see, I mean, this green here has dried and it's flaked up. All I have to do is spray with a spritz bottle a little bit of water, and then I can go ahead and reconstitute and use these paints. That's another reason to use Daniel Smith or Winsor Newton. They reconstitute very nicely, and you don't have to worry about wasting paint because you can always continue to reuse the paints. And lastly, you can also get what's called a travel kit. And I got this from Cheap Joe's. It's an American Journey, and it's in a tin. And these are called pans. And you can take your tube paint and you can squirt it into here. And I kind of level it off, let it dry, and then you can pop these back in. This is a little well that you can paint here, and you can paint on this. And this kind of folds up into a small area. It even has for plein air painting, you know, you can put your thumb in and then you can hold it and you can paint. I'm not a huge fan of this only because I find it kind of heavy and bulky and for traveling, and I actually prefer to work with the palettes, but you don't have to go out and buy a palette. You simply could work on a styrofoam plate or, you know, something that's white. So a styrofoam plate would work just fine. You could put little dabs of paint and have what you want is an area where you're able to mix your paints, and having something be on white, it lets you see the true color. If you were to do it on, let's say one of your kitchen plates that's purple, you know, yes, you'd be able to clean it and reuse it, but you would end up not really being able to see the true color that you're mixing. So my recommendation is that whatever you decide to use, you may have an old white plate, or you go to a garage sale and you find an old white plate or something, you can use that. A lot of times if you have plastic, the plastic will be stained by the pigment and it's hard to get off. So some of the palettes that are out there that are a white plastic, when you go to mix out on mixing area, if it stays there for a long time and then you go to take it off, it will have stained it and it'll be like that the whole entire time. Another thing that I use throughout my watercolor is paper towels. And it's interesting because there's probably, you know, hundreds of paper towel manufacturers out there. And in the United States, I like Bounty. The advertisement is that it's the quicker picker-upper, and it is a very absorbent, it's kind of a spongy, nice and thick paper towel, and I really like it better than anything that I've ever used. It's kind of lint-free, and it can be used over and over and over again, and this is something that I would recommend that you find. Whatever paper towel you decide to work with, you should have something that's going to be absorbent, because it really will help with your watercolor in terms of eliminating some waters and spills. And as we go through the course, you'll see how beneficial a nice absorbent paper towel can be. Another recommendation is Mr. Clean's Magic Eraser. And Mr. Clean's Magic Eraser is something that can be found in the supermarket. And I use it to pick up areas on my paper where I may have spilled paint, where I don't want it in the middle of a painting. And there's a demonstration later on in the videos that will show you how I correct a mistake. If sometimes I actually have had a drawing error where the stem is supposed to be going up into the center of a flower, and for whatever reason I didn't see it until I was done, and I'm able to use Mr. Clean's Magic Eraser Sponge to actually remove the drawing error and fix the painting and salvage it. That's another thing that you can pick up at the grocery store at any point in time. These are the basic supplies that I would recommend, and of course you're going to need, containers for water and that kind of thing, which are easy to find anywhere. It's a yogurt container or a plastic cup or whatever. And I usually think that having two of them is a good thing, one for clean water and one for dirty water. And that's about it. So I hope that you found that this preliminary talk about materials and supplies will help you on your wonderful watercolor journey. And if you have any questions, please feel free to contact me via email, and I'm happy to address any questions that you may have. So let's get started with watercolor. If you are not currently signed up for my wonderful watercolor class and would like more information, please visit my website at www.mindylighthipe.com/online art classes. Thank you. This is Mindy Lighthipe, and thank you for drawing the beauty of nature.